It's about the restoration of our republic. We want to educate, encourage, enable the power. We stand for integrity, honesty, self-reliance, self-defense, and most importantly, no compromise on our foundational principles. This is America's Voice Now.
Find America's Voice Now on Facebook and at americasvoicenow.org. Here's Michael Evans.
Good morning, America. You're listening to America's Voice Now. My name is Michael Evans. I am your host this morning. Appreciate you joining with us. Thanks very much. We're going to cover a number of topics this morning that are of importance in our overall look and scheme of things. And I want you to make sure that you have a notepad and pen ready. Because as we move forward, we're going to cover a couple of different issues this morning that I think are important for you. First and foremost, we're going to talk about the J.P. Morgan settlement of $13 billion. That's right, billion dollars. J.P. Morgan has resolved to pay a $13 billion fine, which will basically absolve them of any guilt during the financial crisis. If you think that that's acceptable, you're on your own, because basically what it means is that they can get away with anything. Now, remember, too, we bailed them out, and basically this means they can get away with anything they so choose as long as the government gets their cut. So what we have is a group of thugs in Washington, D.C., who collude with a group of thugs on Wall Street. They all can do whatever they want. Investors can get hosed. The taxpayers can get hosed. And ultimately, they just trade some money back and forth, and all's well and good. We're going to talk more about that, and we're going to get into that issue, and we're going to talk a little bit about how that is an impact in the Federal Reserve issues. The Fed, there's an article out this morning that's rather disturbing from an author on CNBC, in which Faber is suggesting that the Fed could up the QE infinity, if you will, the quantitative easing, to up to $1 trillion a month. Why? Because, frankly, we're at the point where we don't have the wherewithal to slow the slide, if you will, down the path of utter financial totalitarian collapse. We're going to talk about this J.P. Morgan deal because they're not saying they're guilty. In fact, they're not even apologizing and saying they're sorry. They're just saying, well, here's our $12 billion, here's your cut, and cover it all up, make it all go away, and we'll all get along just fine on Tuesday. I mean, it's unbelievable, actually, how far down the path of tyranny we have fallen. And if this doesn't exemplify it for you, I'm not sure what will. Our second topic this morning is going to revolve around the DHS. Now, Department of Homeland Security has put out a bid to essentially hire private armed guards for the IRS and other government buildings in relation to a location in upstate New York. I believe it's right around the Albany area, in which they are looking for the protection for IRS and other buildings for public demonstrations, civil disturbances. Now, I got to ask you the obvious question. If the DHS believes that they are at a position in which they need to be able to hire armed guards to protect government buildings because they are preparing for civil unrest and public disturbance, are you not getting the message, folks? They know that this is almost over. They recognize that we have reached the end of the line, so to speak. And what that should be telling you, and this will be addressed in our fourth segment, is that it is time for you and your family to get prepared, to be knowledgeable, to be wise, to be situationally aware, and to be ready. Why? Because we are sitting here on a powder keg that is, and lit matches are laying all over the room. And any one of them, and I have to tell you, this doesn't have to necessarily be from the inside. It could be almost anything. And we are sitting on a powder keg that will blow. And when it does, some people are going to be prepared for that. Other people are going to be standing there with their tongues hanging out, wondering what to do next. And I got to tell you, if you're not ready, if you're not prepared, if you don't have any idea what's happening around you, you won't know what to do, when to do it, and you and your family, and you do have a primary responsibility for your family. You will be sitting around trying to elicit aid when there is no aid to be had. I got to tell you, if you are not in a position where you are preparing yourself and your family, you are abdicating your own responsibility towards them. And so I strongly encourage you to have a pen and paper ready. I'm going to give you some information that I want you to be aware of. I'm going to recommend a book that you can get yourself. And there's plenty of them out there, but I want you to, I don't care where you start, I just want you to start. Okay, I'm also going to play for you, in our third segment, a speech by Representative McClintock from California. You know, he wrote this, or he made this speech on the House floor on the 14th of October. And it is extraordinarily appropriate for our current situation today. Because this is probably the most important speech that was given in Congress over the debt limit issue. I want you to listen to it carefully. I want you to read the transcript, and I'm going to give you the link of where you can find it. And I want you to use your critical thinking skills to understand exactly what this man is telling you. Because what he's saying is not a lightly given statement. In fact, I'm going to read you a brief quote, and then we're going to move on to our main topic. Given the ruthlessness and vindictive way the shutdown has been handled, I now believe that this president would willfully act to destroy the full faith and credit of the United States unless the Congress acquiesces to all of his demands, at least as long as he sees political advantage in doing so. His every statement and action is consistent with this conclusion. Ladies and gentlemen, that is perhaps the most stark statement of truth that we heard during the entire debacle about the debt. What he's referring to there is the fact that now the House has given the power of the purse to the executive. And it's not just limited to Obama. It is from this point forward, henceforth, the president will now declare he needs this amount of money, and it is up to the House and the Senate to override the president, which is completely obtuse to what the Constitution calls for. And they will now have to override the president in order to stop the increase in the budget or in the debt borrowing. So what you have to understand is this. Everything that's happening right now in government is diametrically opposed to what our founders envisioned, to what we have come to expect, what we believed our government was all about and based upon. And what we are now looking at is a complete change in everything that we have ever known about government and how it functions, how it handles, how it works, and so forth. This is an important speech. I want you to understand it, and then I'm going to ask you to take a look at it, and I want you to take a look at the actual language of it, because the language of it is telling. Our fourth segment and our final one is going to be about preparedness and what you and your family can and should be doing. We're going to talk about a couple of basic things, including one thing, which is storing up some food and some basic necessities. But in addition to that, how to build something called a BOB, or a bug-out bag. I don't normally get into these types of details on this program. I normally stick to politics. But I got to tell you, with the increasing level of danger that we're approaching, I want you to be aware of the fact that the difference between survival and the difference between an ignominious end may well be whether or not you and your family have the wherewithal to survive for a 30 or a 60 or a 90-day period. And, bug-out bags are typically for a 3-day period. But we're going to talk about a little bit more than that, because there are certain things that you cannot do without. You can't do without water, and you can't do without food, and you can't do without basic hygiene. And there's a lot of things that I think most Americans, especially if you're living in areas that are highly concentrated, not urban necessarily, but suburban even, and I don't think most Americans are fully prepared for that. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, and I'm going to talk about a program that we're going to try to put together, which will give you some basic skill training on how you can prepare yourself and your family. Just some of the basic necessities that you need. Okay? All right. So let's jump into our first story. The first topic that we're going to tackle this morning is this J.P. Morgan project. You know, J.P. Morgan, when the debt crisis occurred, they purchased two other banks. If you recall, Bear Stearns had failed and had gone down in flames. The federal government had bailed out a lot of the other banks, but refused to bail out Bear Stearns. And I don't know whether they weren't the right player or whether they didn't like them. Whatever it was kind of unusual treatment there. And Bear Stearns went belly up. They also bought a company called Washington Mutual that had acquired because basically they were annexing all these smaller banks into these massive too big to fails, if you recall, right? So basically what happened is these banks were acquired. Bear Stearns and Washington Mutual had a bunch of bad debt, and all of it was these subprime mortgages and securities that were frankly worthless paper. And Bear Stearns went out there, and J.P. Morgan went out there, and basically they misled investors into buying this paper. If you've ever watched, there's a couple of movies out about it, but basically the goal of this project was to offload this paper onto unwitting investors who would not realize that it was toilet paper for all intents and purposes. They did it. They made a ton of money at it. They got rid of all this toxic debt. And at the same point in time, those people who were buying it were hosed because they bought it and then found out later on that it was useless and worthless. This is the world's largest bank. J.P. Morgan Chase is the largest bank in the world. Yesterday, or the day before, they agreed to fork over listen to this number, folks, $13 billion as a settlement fine. Now, they're not admitting guilt. In fact, they're not even apologizing. They're just saying that based upon the government's claim, we agree that we're going to pay a settlement figure of $13 billion to make all of this problem go away. If you ever needed an example of preferential treatment under prosecutors, this is exactly what you see. What you have is a corporatocracy. Now, you know, many of you know that I've had a website out there called Corporatocracy for many years, and I kind of merged that with America's Voice Now as we started doing the radio program. And the idea behind a corporatocracy is simply this. Corporations are, for the most part, in control of government, and government functions as a methodology of supporting their efforts, and they're bought and paid for. They pass laws that benefit the corporations. These corporations, in turn, make sure that government remains in power by pumping tons and tons of money into their reelection campaigns. And so it is an inside kind of dirty deal that we have seen over and over and over and over and over. Now, you have to recognize that J.P. Morgan has a multi-trillion-dollar balance sheet, right? Multi-trillion. And for the record, this is only half of 1 year's earnings. So it doesn't really have a whole lot of impact on J.P. Morgan in terms of this $13 billion deal. And since it's all basically electronic zeros anyway, neither the federal government nor J.P. Morgan will be really impacted by the overall implications of this deal. There are those out there who are calling this a shakedown, however. The Wall Street Journal has written an article out there in which they kind of put out an op-ed piece, and in which they kind of state that they feel bad for the CEO, Jamie Dimon. Now, I got to tell you, during the last fiscal thing that just happened a week ago, he was brought in while he's under investigation, I might add, and they're trying to resolve the settlement. He was brought in by the president, along with a number of other high-profile bank CEOs, to advise the government on what would happen if we went over the debt limit and we had the default and the shutdown and all of that nonsense. I got to tell you, that's a bit of a conflict of interest. You know, when the government calls in the main Wall Street thug for advice about what to do, while that thug is currently under investigation by that same exact government, You got to question the conflict of interest position that the government is in and that J.P. Morgan Chase is in. In other words, did Mr. Demon have the ability to go to the government and say, look, this is what's going to happen. We're going to have a complete and utter economic catastrophe, and we're going to close down, and we're going to abandon the government, and we're going to abandon the Wall Street, and we're going to abandon the markets. And if you continue to persecute and prosecute me for this penalty of $13 billion or whatever, we're going or try to put me in prison, then frankly we're just going to abandon the markets. We'll cause the crash. You don't even have to do it. So instead, they now settle on a $13 billion payment that's quite frankly less than 1/2 of 1 year's earnings. Pretty easy, huh? Pretty dirty, huh? Wall Street Journal, on the other hand, has come out and said that federal law enforcers are confiscating roughly half of the company's annual earnings for no other reason than because they can and because they want to appease their left-wing populist allies. Wow. So what you're saying here, Wall Street Journal, is that they're persecuting the J.P. Morgan Chase as a bank and Jamie Dimon personally because they want to appease left-wing allies? I mean, are you trying to tell me that he didn't realize what he was doing when he was dumping those toxic assets? If he knew they were bad, and he did, obviously, because he misled their investors to buying them. If he knew they were bad, then he's got guilty knowledge. And if he said that they were good to those people that were buying them, that's fraud. I don't care how else you twist it. Now, whether he got those from Washington Mutual or Bear Stearns is not really even material to the issue. He didn't have to buy those banks. The Washington Post also came out and is lamenting that, and they use the word persecution. They argue that the Justice Department shouldn't be so backward-looking as to slap the bank, quote, for allegedly misleading investors about the quality of some subprime securities that they marketed before the crash. In fact, they go on to say, roughly 70% of the securities at issue were concocted not by J.P. Morgan, but by the two institutions they bought, Bear Stearns and Washington Mutual. Now, I got to tell you, I feel so bad for Mr. Jamie Dimon, and I feel so bad for J.P. Morgan that I would just as soon see the guy charged with treason, because that's essentially what it was. It's financial treason against our nation. See, these banks are all integrally tied back into the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is the regulatory body that oversees them. They all sit on Federal Reserve ownership boards, maybe not the public boards, but they all sit on every one of these Federal Reserve. And I got to tell you, every Treasury leader who has come out, every Treasury secretary who has come out in the last 50 or 70 years has come from these banks, J.P. Morgan, Chase when it was Chase Manhattan. By the way, J.P. Morgan Chase bought Chase Manhattan, which was the second largest bank. Now they're the super first largest. The point is this. Every one of these people has come out of, including Bernanke, by the way, and all of them, have all come out of these banks. They come into government. They do their Treasury duty as a Secretary of the Treasury for whatever, a 4-year or an 8-year period or a 5-year period or whatever period the president deigns them to sit on the board. When they get out, they go back to their job in the Wall Street banking industry, and they are paid extraordinarily handsomely for their sacrifice of profits during the period in which they served in government, where they only make whatever it is, a couple $100,000 a year, when they could have made tens of millions out in the street. The point is that while they're there as the Treasury Secretary, they are really not influencing the Federal Reserve and the Treasury in regards to what's best for America. They're utilizing that position as an insider and a trader and a turncoat to meld and mold and twist and benefit these banks that they worked for. I got to tell you, we are looking here at perhaps and if history is even remotely accurate, we will look back on this period as perhaps the deepest and most obvious level of corruption that the world has ever seen. Federal Reserve banks, the Federal Reserve itself, the major banks in the United States, who are all bailed out by taxpayer money and then turn around and betray that same nation that just bailed them out. All of us are carrying debt that they're enriching themselves on, and they're doing it with government immunity and government impunity, or persecution or prosecution immunity and impunity. The truth is that when you look back at this period in history, 30, 50, 100 years from now, if history is accurate, and it's always written by the victor, so it remains to be seen who will be the victor. When you look back on this era over time, if there is any truth to history, we are going to look back at this and say, this is an incredibly corrupt period in the history of the United States. Perhaps the greatest level of corruption that we have ever seen in the nation. I got to tell you, I don't believe that $13 billion is sufficient as a settlement, nor do I believe that Mr. DeMond should be out walking the streets. The guy makes, Bernie Madoff look like a piker. The truth is, they run the government, not the other way around. They are not regulated by the government. They are the ones who are regulating the government. Their tie-ins with the Federal Reserve, their tie-ins with international finance, their tie-ins with the International Monetary Fund and central banks around the planet are, for all intents and purposes, the destruction of the United States of America. They are guilty individually and part and parcel to the utter demise of the United States of America. Thomas Jefferson was very clear about debt. Here's what he said. A private central bank issuing public currency is a greater menace to the liberties of the people than a standing army. We must not let our rulers load us with perpetual debt. With respect to future debt, it would be wise and just for the nation to declare in the Constitution that neither the legislature nor the nation itself can validly contract more debt than they can pay within their own age or within the term of 19 years. It is incumbent on every generation to pay its own debts as it goes, a principle which, if acted upon, would save one half of the wars of the world. Ladies and gentlemen, where we are at this point is we are, for all intents and purposes, sheep to be sheared. As taxpayers, as revenue earners, as generators of wealth, the population of the United States is being milked. Our wealth as a nation is being siphoned off into the pockets of these major international and national banking systems, the central banks of the world, and they're using that wealth to essentially enslave us. One, to debt, and two, in a much more physical manner. If you have not seen the spread, the rising tide of totalitarianism here in the United States, authoritarianism, you are completely and utterly blinded to what is going on around you. You have no situational awareness whatsoever. When you see things like the NSA and the IRS being used as a weapon of mass destruction against the population, when you see health care under the guise of Obamacare being used not really to provide health care, but to be used as a method and a means to control the population, and you don't acknowledge that for what it is, you're blinded to your own bias. I want to make you aware that the Ozark Property Rights Coalition, before we jump, is going to be meeting on Thursday, and that's 2 days from today. So if you have an opportunity to and you would like to attend that, that's going to be held out in their brand new location because they've moved now from where they were. The Ozark Property Rights Coalition, which used to meet in the Hayloft restaurant, has found a new place to meet in Mountain Grove. It's at the Connection Entertainment Center on Business Route 60. So write this down. Take this down as a note. Bob Parker is the co-chair of that organization. He meets with, and Doreen Hannes is the other co-chair. They have a great property rights coalition out there. If you are in the Mountain Grove area and you would like to participate in that, the date for that meeting is going to be the 24th. That's this Thursday, October 24th. And they meet the fourth Thursday of every month. This will be the last meeting before Thanksgiving and Christmas. And so the meeting occurs from 7 to 9 p.m. That's 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. If you want more information about it and you need directions to get to the Connection Restaurant and the Connection Center, you can certainly go to prcnews.org. That's prcnews.org. P as in Peter or Papa, R as in Romeo, C as in Charlie. That's PropertyRightsCoalitionNews.org. Excellent website. You should be visiting it on a routine basis anyway. Even if you're not local to the area, you will gain an enormous amount of information by visiting that website. If you are, I mean, when I look at our overview of who's listening and watching the show around the nation, I see folks from Florida and Colorado. I see folks from New Jersey and Maine and California, Texas. If you're not local to the area, fear not. Get over to prcnews.org. Get an opportunity to understand what the PRCs do. These folks are the ones that were responsible, as an example, for the ending of the Blue Ways. And make sure that you are educating yourself about what the nature of property rights supporting grassroots efforts are to support and defend your own property in your area. Then, if you want, you can get information from these people who run these, like Bob Parker and Doreen Hannes. You can get information from Kevin Jotz, who runs the group down in Mammoth. You can get information from all these different organizations and identify what is necessary to open up a chapter in your local area. Remember, our job is to be individual leaders within our circles of influence. So if you've got a county area, it's generally by county. These are like county-sized chapters. Open a county chapter in your area. I don't care if you're in Texas or Florida or Maine or in Chicago. Doesn't make any difference. Open a property rights coalition group in your community, in your county, and make sure that you're making a difference. We were able to block a federal program. That's almost unheard of for a little podunk place like the Ozarks. So I want you to make sure that you're cognizant and aware of it. Get to prcnews.org. You can find information about this meeting that's going to occur on Thursday, the 24th. And in addition to that, if you're not local, and of course you can't make this local meeting, then you can at least find out information on how to start a PRC of your own. Okay, we're going to take a quick break. When we return, we will talk about our next topic, which is the DHS hiring armed guards. Armed guards, folks, to protect government buildings in the event of civil unrest. If they're planning on it, what do they know that you're not listening to? You're listening to America's Voice Now. You can find us on the web by going to americasvoicenow.org. You can find us by also going to our Facebook page, which is facebook.com/America's Voice Now. And then lastly, you can find this and every other program that we do streamed on our website every morning. You can find the video clip of that at our YouTube channel at youtube.com/America's Voice Now. We'll be right back. Stick with us. This should be an interesting topic.